I'm Bob Miller. I'm president of Marin Conservation League and chair of MCL's Climate Action Working Group. And the mission of Marin Conservation League is to preserve, protect, and enhance the natural assets of Marin in a changing climate. And of course, a big part of it, in a changing environment. And a big part of a changing environment is a changing climate. And so this committee focuses a good deal on clean energy, electrification, to some extent carbon sequestration, really on removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, preventing them being emitted. And today, I'm going to show you our agenda. And essentially, the whole first part of the meeting will be about offshore wind in California's North Coast. A second agenda item is a discussion of the letter that Marin Conservation League sent on building on the Marin County Building Electrification Ordinance. We'll be discussing a letter that, or comments that Marin Conservation League submitted on the California Air Resources Board greenhouse gas emission reduction scoping plan for 2045. And we're going to be having a discussion about the Supreme Court versus EPA's decision. We may well have some comments from Bell Cole on that, and then reports from organizations and announcements. Are there any additions to the agenda that anybody would like to suggest? If not, then let's go to the first item on the agenda, which is offshore wind in California's North Coast. Ken Strong is the person that has helped organize this part of the meeting. So I'm going to hand this off to Ken.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Can you stop sharing? And can you stop sharing your screen, please?
Ken, we can't hear you.
Yes.
I am not muted. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good.
We still can't hear you.
Well, some of us can.
Bob, we can hear.
Yeah, it's only you, Bob.
So I just put you on mute. Why don't you unmute and let's see.
Okay. Bob, I'm here. Can you stop sharing screen? I can hear, they can hear me.
Yeah.
Can you hear? I don't think he can hear you either, Bill.
You can't hear me? Can he hear me?
Okay, so the problem was probably on my end. My apologies. Why don't you keep on going, Ken?
All right. Can you stop sharing your screen, please?
Or text him to stop sharing the screen.
There we are. Wonderful. Oh, thank you. Finally. All right, there we go. Well, thank you, everybody. The reason why are we talking about offshore wind today? And the reason for that, I want to set the stage for that a little bit. So California's SB 100 goals, which were passed under the 100% Clean Energy Act of 2018, called for 100% clean energy by 2045. Under that plan, there will be in 2030 17 gigs of utility scale solar, 69 gigs of utility solar by 2045, wind onshore of 8.2 gigs by 2030, 12.6 by 2045. And offshore wind, they have it coming on by 2045 at 10 gigs. And so offshore wind is a significant part of our planning goals in order to get to 100% clean energy. The CPUC and its integrated resource planning process calls for 195 megawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and 1.7 gigawatts by 2032. To put something else in perspective, 1 megawatt of utility scale solar consumes about 10 acres of land. So if we are going to have 69 gigawatts of utility scale solar by 2045, that's going to be roughly 690,000 acres of land, which is roughly 1,000 square miles. So ramping up offshore wind is important not only for achieving our energy goals, but also is important for mitigating those impacts on our land resources. There's a planning process well underway. Wind studies have been done. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has done a lengthy study to identify what areas off the coast of California are best adapted for offshore wind. They've identified 2 areas, a Morro Bay wind energy area, or WIA, and a Humboldt WIA off of Humboldt. And there also is an ABA 525 process that we will hear more about to identify the maximum feasible wind energy production off California. So we've decided to focus on Humboldt, the Humboldt WIA, because it seems closer to us. It's Northern California. And in order to talk about that, we have 2 speakers. The first is Lori Biandini, who's the Director of Business Planning and Finance for the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, the CCA to the north of us. She's been there about 10 years. She will tell us about their partnership exploring offshore wind and what's involved in developing offshore wind in Northern California. She has a BA in environmental science and an MA in social science with an emphasis on environment and community and as a member of the Hoopa Valley tribe. She's then going to be followed by Irene Gutierrez, who's an attorney in the Oceans Division of the Natural Resources Defense Council. NRDC authored co-authored a couple of fairly extensive studies or reports or comments, she may characterize them differently, to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management about the things that need to be considered as we move forward to offshore wind in terms of its potential impact offshore and nearshore on fish, marine mammals, birds, and other benthic organisms. And so she'll be talking about some of their thinking, NRDC's thinking on offshore wind as far as it relates to some of those risks to the offshore environment. So with that, Laura, you might get started if you can.
Great. Thank you, Ken. Just
there we go.
Try to share my screen. All right, is that working out?
Yes.
All right. And I'll apologize in advance. I tried to get my cat's energy out this morning, but she's still very curious about what's going on, so she might be here. So good morning. Thank you, Ken, for that introduction. I'm Lori Biandini. I'm the Director of Business Planning and Finance for the Redwood Coast Energy Authority. RCA is a joint powers authority of the County of Humboldt and the incorporated cities within the county, as well as the Humboldt Bay Municipal Water District. RCEA was actually formed in 2003 with the goal of promoting sustainable energy initiatives in our community. And we operated solely with grant and contract funding until 2017, at which time our JPA was amended to allow our CEA to become our community's community choice aggregator. And all qualified jurisdictions within Humboldt County eventually joined our CCA, and our CEA began providing electricity generation services to its first customers in May of 2017. Ready? So yeah, briefly, I'd like to touch upon the state of California energy goals that Ken mentioned, just as context for why offshore wind energy generation is a concept that more and more folks should become aware of and interested in. This quote from the National Renewable Energy Lab, or NREL publication: state power system planning is expected to eventually address California's requirement to achieve 100% of total retail electricity sales from renewable energy and zero carbon resources by 2045, as mandated by Senate Bill 100. To comply with these directives, California needs to investigate the further development of energy efficiency, storage, and a diverse range of renewable energy, zero carbon emission, and transmission resources, including offshore wind. So studies have indicated that SB 100 is technically achievable through multiple pathways. And we're seeing that through policies being implemented. But it requires building new resources at an unprecedented rate. The governor has included $45 million in this year's state budget to create the Offshore Wind Energy Deployment Facility Improvement Program at the California Energy Commission, which will invest in activities to advance the capabilities of deploying offshore wind energy in federal waters off California in the areas of facility planning and development. And I actually just noticed that there's another about 8 million in there for various other agencies to focus on offshore wind. So this is becoming, I guess, urgent. So then this slide, I wanted to just show all of you, or remind all of you, that we have a world-class wind energy resource just off the west coast of the US. The darkest blue areas on this map are around Cape Mendocino and the California-Oregon border. So here, off the north coast, we have a really untapped wind energy resource that is one of the best in the world. So RCEA's serious inquiry into offshore wind energy actually began in early 2016, following Castle Wind's unsolicited lease application to the Bureau of Energy Management for an area off the coast of Morro Bay. We started noticing curious Europeans in suits wandering around Eureka, asking about offshore wind. And RCEA's Community Choice Energy Program, which is what we call our CCA services, was launched with a goal adopted by our board of providing 100% locally generated renewable electricity to our Humboldt County customers by 2030. And we had already identified offshore wind as our biggest local untapped renewable energy resource, based on studies that NREL had done that, produced that map that we just saw. So we decided that we really wanted community-driven development in Humboldt County. We didn't necessarily want Europeans in suits to be making decisions that were going to affect our community without our input. So in 2018, we put out a request for qualifications for development partners that would actually form a public-private partnership with RCEA. We were really focused on upfront stakeholder engagement on how to do this, and included the broader community in the RFQ process. And then in 2008, after we had selected development partners, we submitted our own unsolicited lease a request to the Bureau of Energy Management that was based on this community input and had several letters of community support associated with it. So although it may feel kind of sudden to most of California's broader public, the reality is that our CEA has been active and engaged in bringing offshore wind to fruition for our local community for quite a while. Meanwhile, it's been a while since 2016, 2018. So meanwhile, we've continued just being active and engaged with our community about this possibility. So some of the examples I put up here on the slide of how we've done so is we've continued collaboration with the Humboldt Fishermen's Marketing Association and supported their involvement in creating the California Fishermen's Resiliency Association, which now has 7 port members that are all the way from Crescent City up near the Oregon border down to San Francisco. We've hired a consultant, Last Coast Wind, to engage with our local tribes and tribal entities to assess their capacity and interest in offshore wind and document any concerns, with the goal of being able to fill in gaps for tribes or tribal entities that don't necessarily have the resources to put into engagement with us. We've always been in close communication with trade labor unions, particularly the operating engineers up here. And we are also supporting work of the Humboldt Bay Harbor Commission, who received $11 million in funds as part of the governor's budget through the CEC for offshore wind related planning and port development that will be necessary for supporting an offshore wind industry, both here and potentially, other places where it might be developed along the northern West Coast. And we continue to participate in community-led forums. We want the community really to feel ownership of the process. So, at the time that Castle Wind first submitted their unsolicited lease application, technology to support offshore wind at deep ocean depths was limited to demonstration projects in Portugal, Japan, and Norway. Since then, projects have become operational off the coast of Scotland and France as well. But still, floating wind makes up less than 1% of total offshore wind energy projects. But most of the offshore wind resource is located further out in the ocean, beyond what is economically and technically feasible for current fixed platform technology capability. So that had really been a key turning point for realizing offshore wind in deep waters like what's off the coast of California. So currently, floating wind costs are about double of those, double those of fixed offshore wind, but in-rail studies suggest that floating projects could achieve cost parity with their fixed bottom counterparts around 2030. So this slide is showing some of the floating technologies that that have been developed so far and demonstrated. So the far left is called a spar buoy, and the 30 megawatt high wind project in Scotland, which has been operational since 2017, uses that technology. There's also a proposed project off the coast of Norway that is planning on using this spar buoy technology. And then the far right is called a tension-legged platform. And the idea is that it's being kept from turning over by tight mooring to the seafloor. And then the middle is an example of a semi-submersible floating platform, which is the technology that was proposed by our development partners. So specifically, Principal Power's wind float is what we think will work best for our Humboldt wind energy area. They've had a successful 5-year pilot project that happened in Portugal with a 2 megawatt turbine. And after they were done with the pilot project in Portugal, that same wind float was redeployed to Scotland for 3 years. They then built out Wind Float Atlantic off the coast of Portugal in 2019, which is a 25 megawatt project. It's operational. And following that, 50 megawatts in Scotland in 2021. And they have 4 additional projects in planning stages, including ours and a 1,000 megawatt project off the coast of South Korea, which I think it's of note that INREL considers anything over 500 megawatts to be a commercial scale, and a lot of all the projects so far haven't met that threshold, and we really didn't anticipate the project in Humboldt, which is what we proposed was 100 to 150 megawatts to meet that threshold either. So it could be that, it's needed in great numbers, but, starting out small might be what we end up doing. So this is just a picture of a wind float with a turbine on top being towed out to its wind farm and off the coast of Scotland, and an example of maybe how it would look from our port is it would be built and then towed out to place. The wind float is turbine agnostic, so it can be deployed independently of water depth or seabed conditions as well, and can be built to accommodate bigger and bigger turbines as they are developed. And this is actually just a simulation that Acker Solutions put together, one of our development partners, of what the Redwood offshore wind project might look like out at sea, which is just a handful of turbines there floating. And then this is actually simulation of what a heavy lift dock might look like in our Humboldt Bay harbor. And as you can see, it needs to be big enough to lay these turbines down so they can be delivered from wherever they're coming from, and then stood up and put on a wind float and towed out to where it needs to be. And this is just another angle. So Humboldt Bay is kind of similar in shape to San Francisco Bay, although much, much smaller. But it has a long peninsula of land, and currently it's a lot of industry, as well as defunct industry, such as old lumber mills that are no longer in use, but also like oyster farms that are in use. So you can see it's just rather flat, and would be a good place for a big dock to build these things. So yeah, I just wanted to briefly go over where we are in the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's renewable energy authorization process. They put together this nice graphic for us. So we just have completed or reached the point where they've completed an environmental review and federal consistency for the lease process. So that is necessary, to actually publish sort of the details of the lease process before the auction. And they've done us the favor of publishing a proposed lease notice that can allow for comments and feedback before they publish the final lease notice. And as you can see, this is where we're expecting to have an auction in fall of 2022, and everything thereafter would likely take several years. So this proposed sale notice it contains information pertaining to the areas available for leasing, certain provisions and conditions of the lease, action details, and criteria for evaluating competing bids. And with the release of this proposed sale notice, they're specifically asking and seeking feedback on engaging underserved communities, bidding credits for workforce and supply chain development, which have been proposed to be about 20% of the final auction bid, how to incorporate community benefits agreements into this process or this stage of the process, and industry standards for environmental protection, as well as other details. So it's an important time to provide feedback, although it is just one step in the overall process. There will be other parts of community input with the actual lease stipulations as well after the auction. And then just from a developer standpoint, what this timeline of several years looks like is having a lease auction, doing site assessment, surveys, and environmental analysis for about 4 years. Getting all the plans together to submit to the authorities, and then we expect that BOEM would take a couple years to review all the construction and planning and environmental documents that have been prepared. And then if it goes forward, another year for fabrication and construction, assuming that we've got a supply chain set up at that point, and then another year for actual deployment. So yeah, this is, it's longer than I think we initially thought would happen when we're hearing Ala Weinstein talk about Castle Wind projects. It was sounding like a 5 to 7 year process, and it's already been 5 years of just getting to this point. So it's a long process, but that's all I have.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. We'll take most of the questions at the end, but I did want to ask you one thing right now that might set the stage. Is the Humboldt WIA area that is going to be potentially leased? Can you tell us how far offshore of Humboldt Bay that is, and whether there's any visual impact likely once the thing gets the turbines are up?
Sure. The plan is, so the wind energy area is about 21 to 25 miles off the shore of Humboldt Bay. And so there won't be any visual impact from most places. But I don't know if you're familiar with our area, but if you go up to Trinidad Head, for example, or a little bit up, up the mountains around that area, you can probably see them. So yeah, from some people's views, they will be visible. Okay,
all right, good. But I thought that at least sets a stage for where they're going to be. All right, well, thank you very much, Lori. Irene, are you ready to share screen and take over?
Yeah, I am. Let me try sharing my screen.
Lori, you may need to unshare.
Yeah.
Great. Are folks able to see my first slide?
Not yet.
Sorry, I'm just trying to find my controls here.
Well, I guess while we work on the technology, I'll just note briefly again who I am. So I'm Irene Gutierrez. I'm a senior attorney with NRDC's Oceans team, and I'm based in our San Francisco office. For those of you that don't know my organization, we are an over 50-year-old organization. We have been at the forefront of the environmental movement since that time, working on campaigns related to clean air, clean energy, clean water, basically every environmental issue that you can think of. One of our priorities in recent years has been working on ways to fight the climate crisis. And so working on clean energy solutions like offshore wind is a key part of that. And also fighting dirty energy projects is another key element of our climate strategy when it comes to thinking about energy solutions as relates to the oceans. I'll pause and just double check. Can folks now see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great, wonderful. Anyway, so it's exciting to talk to this group. It's really exciting to talk to folks who care about clean energy and climate issues around the states, and in this state in particular, because California has an important leadership role to play when it comes to clean energy. And so it's exciting to be here and looking forward to being in discussion with you all. So as you probably gathered from that sort of brief snippet that I started with, NRDC cares is trying to balance a couple of things when it comes to looking at renewable energy deployment off the coast of California. So obviously, wind energy is really important for climate policy. We are at the brink of a climate crisis, and it's really important to take strong action now to shift the trajectories that we only have a few years to change. At the same time, it is also really essential to make sure that wind energy development happens in an environmentally responsible way. I'm sure you all live in Marin, or I'm sure many of you live in Marin, so you know what the California coast is like. And the California coast and the marine environment off the California coast is a remarkably rich ecosystem. It's habitat for a number of endangered and threatened species. It supports a number of valuable commercial fisheries, and there are many other users of this environment, from tribal groups who use the environment for cultural and subsistence purposes, as well as many recreational users of different stripes. I really love swimming in the San Francisco Bay myself. I kayak from time to time and am a very, very bad free diver and spearfisher person, but hope to get better sometime. So I'll touch on the environmental concerns that we have at NRDC, or the high level environmental concerns that we have at NRDC about offshore wind development. So as you saw from Lori's slide, a number of floating wind technologies use systems that have floating platforms that are anchored to the seafloor by a variety of means. And there is the potential with technologies like that whales and sea turtles could be entangled either by the lines that are hanging down from the platforms or through forms of secondary entanglement. The California coast is a really active fishing region. And so there is the possibility of ghost nets being entangled in those lines, and those also serving as hazards for whales, dolphins, sea lions, and other types of marine mammals, as well as sea turtles and other types of organisms. So the entanglement of whales and sea turtles, sometimes diving birds as well, is a concern for us and something that we want to make sure is taken into account as wind development goes forward. Negative interactions with birds and bats is also something that we are concerned about. The aerial corridors off the California coast are important habitat and migrating routes for various species, including endangered species like the short-tailed albatross. And these species could be affected by striking turbines that are in operation, or they could also be affected by the noise from operation and construction activities. Another concern is impacts to benthic habitat. The platforms do need to be anchored to the surface floor, and there's the potential that they could disturb key habitat. So making sure that they're sited in places that support the anchoring systems is something that's important for us and something important to make sure is done in a sustainable way. The turbines may also impact fisheries in different ways. There are some studies showing that they could be fish aggregating devices. Depending on how the arrays are spaced, they could also have impacts on fishermen that use certain types of gear to conduct operations. They may have impacts on trawl arrays and the like. There are also studies showing that turbines may affect wind speeds in the area, which then in turn affect upwelling and nutrient cycling in the ocean, which is essential for having a healthy food chain and making sure that ecosystems continue in a healthy way. And they may also affect other types of community uses. And data needs are also really important. There's a lot that we don't know about the impact that offshore wind will have on ecosystems and various species in the marine environment. And it's important to make sure that we keep collecting data as planning and deployment goes forward, and that we commit to an adaptive management process to make sure that there are mechanisms for addressing new issues that may come up and tweaking management regimes to make sure that they're as protective as possible of the marine environment. And I'll just, I guess by way of illustration, a colleague from Oceana prepared the maps that I'm showing you. So you can see from this map that the Humboldt wind energy area does encompass some areas of essential fish habitat. That's habitat that is needed for juvenile fish and other stages of key species life cycles. It also encompasses areas of rocky reef and habitat for deep sea corals and sponges, which can take decades and decades to reach maturity. So this is just to point out that there are some areas of concern in the Humboldt wind energy area that we want to make sure that we're managing that appropriately and taking measures to mitigate impacts to those environments. And then this slide also shows the overlap between the Humboldt wind energy area and humpback whale critical habitat. This is habitat that whales need in order to reproduce and feed. And so you can see that the Humboldt wind energy area is an area that is used extensively and necessary for the life cycle of humpback whales. So at NRDC, and we've commented on as Ken has mentioned, in the processes that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has had on the West Coast. We're also very active when it comes to wind development on the Eastern Seaboard. And there are a number of conditions that we have recommended in these BOEM processes, as well as various state processes related to offshore wind, as conditions that can help mitigate the risks that we see and allow environmentally sustainable and responsible offshore wind development to go forward. So one is having there be a robust system for environmental review. There are statutes like the National Environmental Policy Act that applies at different stages of the wind development process in federal waters. There may also be times when the California Environmental Quality Act applies, such as if there's any new transmission infrastructure that's built out to accommodate wind energy that's generated offshore, other pieces of infrastructure on state lands. That's an instance where CEQA would apply. And it is really important to have this process be robust so that we understand what we can about the environmental impacts of developing a wind energy, the environmental impacts of developing individual projects, as well as impacts like cumulative impacts. So we're looking towards 2045 and having there be a number of wind projects in the water. It's important that we take a look at what this means cumulatively when you have a number of projects going at once and transmission lines and other pieces of infrastructure serving those projects. Another thing that's important is to have there be robust monitoring programs so that we understand the impact that operations are having in near real time. It's also important for things like entanglement concerns. Whales won't last very long if they're entangled in debris or in lines. And so it's important for there to be systems that allow response in time to free a trapped whale. And then, as I mentioned before, it is important to have there be adaptive management systems that are iterated as time goes on, so that as we learn more, we can tailor management conditions to the risks that we know more about and are learning more about. Mitigating entanglement risks, in addition to monitoring, there are potentially things that can be done when it comes to the design of mooring lines or inter-array cables that can reduce entanglement risks to whales and other types of organisms. There can also be things that are done with turbine design, the design of lighting arrays, the ways that lighting is deployed and used at different types of day that minimize the risks that turbines will attract birds and bats, and reduce turbine strikes in that way. And then there are things like restricting where lines can be anchored that help protect benthic habitat. So we've commented extensively on these conditions, and if folks are curious, I can send along our comment letters to Ken so that you can spend more time with the recommendations that we've made to reduce these risks. Lori talked about the permitting process already from BOEM's standpoint. So I guess I'll just touch briefly on other agencies that are involved in the wind development process. So in addition to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management that handles things like planning for wind energy areas and the lease sales and approving the construction and operation plans of developers, the California Coastal Commission is a key agency in the wind development process. It ensures that wind projects are consistent with the state coastal management plan and makes sure that there won't be adverse effects to state coastal environments that are receiving energy from wind projects and other aspects of wind infrastructure. Other important agencies are the California Energy Commission and the Public Utilities Commission, which are both key agencies when it comes to planning wind procurement targets, planning for infrastructure and transmission lines related to the build out of wind, and planning for the state's energy mix going forward. And other agencies that are involved from time to time for projects that might affect marine mammals, the National Marine Fisheries Service is involved. And the Pacific Fishery Management Council has also been following wind rather attentively because there are also ways in which wind developments could affect fisheries and the fishermen who would like to keep fishing the California current ecosystem. Moving pieces that we see at NRDC over the next few years. So there's the California proposed sale notice. Comments close on August 1. Lori already touched on what BOEM is soliciting in this proposed sale notice. So I'll just note that we at NRDC are planning on commenting on this notice and reiterating the environmental conditions that we think should be part of lease stipulations that apply to developers. We also appreciate that the proposed sale notice uses a multi-factor bidding process that gives credit to developers for investing in community benefit agreements and thinking about ways to enhance the domestic supply chain and support domestic labor. And we think that it's also an important place to think about crediting developers for investing in research related to environmental impact and the mitigations that are needed to support responsible offshore wind development. Another pending proceeding is the California Energy Commission's implementation of AB 525. So AB 525 is a statute that tasks the California Energy Commission with developing planning targets for offshore wind procurement. as well as developing a strategy to look at how to procure that amount of offshore wind and also study the impacts to various stakeholders, including various stakeholders and the environment off the California coast. The California Energy Commission is likely going to set the initial set of planning goals during its August business meeting. So if folks are curious, that's another place to comment about the future of wind development in California. And there'll be other stages in that AB 525 implementation process as well. CEC will come out with its final strategic plan in June, I believe, of 2023. So there will be other comment opportunities to the California Energy Commission as time goes on. And then other potential moving pieces, we may see more wind energy areas proposed off the California coast. There may also be, there has been talk about whether the area off Vandenberg Air Base in state waters is an appropriate site for offshore wind development, so we could see more activity there. And then as time moves on, there will also be actual plans from developers that they'll be part of state and federal processes. So those are also opportunities for public comment. And that is my presentation. This is my email in case folks have more questions.
Thanks, Irene. A couple of questions I have, and then we can, if other people have questions, you can put them in the chat, or we can try a raised hand function as well. But one thing that I thought might inform things just a little bit is you talked about how the Humboldt WEA area is impacted by a couple of these sensitive areas. And I thought it might just be a little bit helpful for people to understand what the process was and who the stakeholders were that BOEM was talking with that ended up with the WEA areas they picked, and how DOD and marine sanctuaries and those sorts of things may have played into that.
Lori may have some good perspective on that, and I'm happy to fill in because I imagine that you were actually part of those processes, Lori.
Sure. So one of the major things that BOEM did was put together an intergovernmental task force with the state of California, and they essentially invited stakeholders from everywhere to participate on this intergovernmental task force. So that was one way of trying to do, a community planning approach. They also, the state of California developed something called a data basin, and they went around and did kind of a roadshow in different areas and talked to all, different stakeholders, environmental groups, fishing community, Native American tribes, to solicit input that would go into this data basin. And so they would sort of have a big database of information that they could pull from. I do know that the fishing community, as an example, was hesitant to release a lot of their, proprietary kind of information about where they fished. But we have a lot of information about vessel traffic that could be, sort of inferred as to where fishing was happening. So yeah, it was a extensive process. I hope Irene could probably fill in maybe more from the environmental point of view.
Yeah, the environmental community was part of some of the convenings that happened. Senator Carbajal has been very excited about supporting offshore wind development, so we participated in some of those convenings. Other stakeholders that had been fairly vocal in the federal and state processes that we haven't mentioned yet. So the Department of Defense uses the areas off the California coast as training grounds. So DOD has also been really interested in where offshore wind projects are sited. And then we've also seen in recent months a lot of activity from merchant shippers off of the California coast who are concerned about the placement of wind developments interfering with shipping lanes. So I guess that's just to say that there are a lot of active stakeholders who both support developing solutions to the climate crisis and also want to make sure that their interests are represented in this process.
Okay, great. So if anybody has any questions now would be a good time to ask. Go ahead, Bob. You're muted.
So there's been a fair amount of discussion about offshore wind on the East Coast. And I'm wondering, how does the importance of offshore wind on the West Coast, or the potential importance, compared to the East Coast? And are there lessons that have been learned from whatever has been done on the East Coast that are usable here?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and say I definitely think there are lessons learned from the East Coast regarding the multi-factor auction format. And so I think that, and that describes basically that, the highest monetary bid isn't necessarily going to be the winner. There will be multi-factors where they've got this formula for credits applied based on different factors. And I think that we can learn a lot about how that works from watching the East Coast auctions. Can also learn a little bit about community stakeholder input and how that affects the process. We won't necessarily have exactly, the same community stakeholder input as the East Coast, but just, figuring out how to best listen and incorporate community concerns and needs.
And I'll just add that there have been a couple of lease auctions already off of the East Coast. And so there will be lessons learned as that leasing process moves forward, how developers and regulatory agencies deal with mitigating potential environmental risks from offshore wind development. It's just a little bit advanced of where California and Oregon are in their wind development processes. I think there's some good lessons to be learned as those processes move forward first.
Okay. Dan?
Hi, thanks Irene and Lori for those great presentations. I was wondering, and this may be something you're not as familiar with, kind of on the economic side, if there's a certain size that you have to have of a offshore wind farm, so to speak, to justify the transmission line that has to run, or maybe that's not a big deal because the transmission line is cheap. I don't know, but that's kind of the heart of the question. And then, where your grid interconnection is going to be, and are there any difficulties or issues there, or is that all pretty easy?
Sure. So I guess right now we have done studies for the Humboldt area and have determined that a project of up to about 150 megawatts would be feasible with the current transmission infrastructure, with our current transmission infrastructure. And anything beyond that would likely need an upgraded transmission infrastructure in order to get the excess energy to other places in the state. If we all of a sudden decided to use more energy around Humboldt, might not be a problem, but considering our current load, our energy needs, that beyond 150 would likely be exported outside the county. And right now we have two kind of vulnerable transmission pathways to the bigger transmission corridors along towards the middle of the state. And it would take a lot of upgrades in order to make those capable of supporting a project or projects bigger than 150 megawatts or so. But we're also looking at other transmission corridors. So at this point, the undersea cables connecting the wind energy generation would land onshore at around Humboldt Bay, and we have a substation there, and so that's where it would connect to our local distribution system. But then, yeah, getting anything larger outside the county would require upgrades to those, either the two that exist or building a new one. And I know that NREL has done studies about, could we, bypass the coast and take it down, a sea level or a seabed cable, or would it make sense to maybe build a corridor from Humboldt down through like Mendocino and Sonoma counties? So there are options being explored, but that's I think that got at your question.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Thanks.
Nona?
Hey, these installations are not going to happen in my lifetime. I already recognize that. But I'm listening, particularly interested in NRDC's examination of this and their involvement in it. Because what I see just from a kind of a general perspective is setting up more environmental traps for species, our offshore species, as these installations go forward. So I don't know whether you can address that from the NRDC perspective. We're counting on you to follow these proposals very, very closely, notwithstanding the need for offshore energy, or for, I should say, for more renewable energy. But the new traps, the new environmental traps for whales, for seabirds, all are of great concern. And maybe you can say something more about what should we say, the precautionary principle that you are applying to these as they move along.
Yeah, I agree with all of those things. It's crucial for wind development to go forward. It's also crucial for it to go forward in a way that protects ecosystems and species of concern. I would say that I've been heartened by some things that we've seen from existing regulatory processes. The California Coastal Commission looked at both the Humboldt and the Morro Bay wind energy areas and placed a number of conditions on BOEM, which then need to be passed on to developers. And there were some good measures that in those various conditions that were that came out of the consistency review process at the California Coastal Commission. So things like mandatory vessel speeds that are kept at limits that avoid and minimize risks to mammals in the area, conditions related to anchoring on benthic habitat, conditions related to the fishing community and preserving the rights of the fishing community, and many other conditions. So I think that that's been a fruitful place for making sure that there is some regulatory oversight of the conditions that apply to developers and making sure that there are protections in place. The lease sale process, as it moves forward, is also going to be an important one for making sure that strong environmental conditions are put in place and apply to developers. And yeah, I think it's really essential to scrutinize the various state and federal processes as they move along and yeah, comment and push for conditions where appropriate.
Okay, we're counting on you. We're counting on you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Sebastian.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Hey, Lori, quick question. Sebastian Kahn, MCE Public Affairs here. I had a question about the financing of the transmission lines that would be necessary to connect the offshore wind to the grid. Is that something that the developer would be paying for, or is that something that's recovered amongst PG&E's rate base?
I don't think we know that yet. I think it'll probably need to be maybe a multi-part lift is what I'm imagining. So ratepayers other state funds. And I don't know, I think that the developers will likely be motivated though to invest in transmission upgrades if they want to, fully build out bigger projects.
Thank you.
I had, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, just to help get a scale of this, so Lori, you said it's 150 megawatts. You said somewhere else it's about 2 megawatts per turbine. So I'm picturing this as roughly 75 turbines out there. And do you know how much area that would kind of cover? Just trying to get a feeling of, the physical scale of it. Thank you.
Yeah, so Principal Power's wind float started out as a demonstration project with a 2 megawatt turbine, but they actually have been getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so, we anticipate being able to, have maybe an 8 to 10 megawatt turbine on top of each float, which is why the demonstration project I showed only, maybe 10 to 12 or so floating objects in the ocean. And for scale wise, I actually don't know that off the top of my head, but I can get back to you.
Is it a fair assumption that the environmental impacts would go down as the megawatts per turbine goes up and you have fewer platforms? Is that kind of a win for everyone? You have presumably larger turbine, more efficient power generation, and also fewer platforms needed, which I assume makes environmental impacts lower. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, and I would say it's a fair assumption for some environmental impacts. I don't know how wind turbine size affects birds, for example, or the upwelling issue that Irene mentioned, but I would think that it would be a good thing for the fishing community to have fewer and yeah, for the anchoring effects.
Thank you.
Belle?
Yes. Lori, you mentioned that that you had worked with the Fishermen's associations, and that you had their support for moving ahead. And I'd be interested in kind of the issues that they raised and whether this is continuing or whether there are problems here. I'm sure there are some. So could you comment on that?
Sure. I wouldn't say that we have their support. I would say that the Humboldt Fishermen's Marketing Association has support for community-led, or supports the community-led development. But I think really they're like, they know that it's going to likely happen. I don't know if I think they would prefer no offshore wind be built. So just putting that out there, I don't know if support would be a good word, but yeah, their concerns were just losing fishing grounds. They feel like they're already limited by, marine sanctuary areas or other areas where they can't go. And so I think the main concern is just losing the ability to access certain areas of the ocean. So that's big. They're also, don't know how it's going to affect their the fish that they, use as a resource that they harvest. So I think there's those concerns as well. Yeah, I have other thoughts about it, but I don't know. I think it might be best to probably reach out to or look at what they've put out there publicly at this point. Yeah.
Thanks.
Bob.
Ken, maybe you would like to go ahead with your question and then followed by me. You've been waiting patiently.
Well, I think to some extent it got answered as far as what the transmission upgrades. I mean, from what I've read for what's being contemplated in the full build out of the Humboldt WIA, they're talking about there's currently a couple of 500 kV lines that would need to be those existing lines would need to be beefed up by taller transmission towers, heavier lines. And that's what the plan would be for onshore. Is that your understanding, Lori?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So they're at least not at this point. Are there any studies that are suggesting there would be an entirely new transmission land corridor?
Yeah, there are, yeah, there is that possibility.
Okay.
I will look for the NREL map that shows that. I think it's in their cost study that I saw that. Okay.
And I would say that I put the Irene's report on their joint comments with Sierra Club and Audubon into the chat. There's a link in there to it. So if people want to get it, that's one way to get it. Go ahead, Bob.
For something like this, I always like to get a sense of scale of how important offshore wind could be to the grid. And so 150 megawatts is large from some perspectives, but very, very small in terms of the total in California. I guess the question is, for California as a whole, have there been any estimates bandied around about what the commercial feasibility is of offshore wind? I mean, presumably there are other areas which there is already transmission capacity from power plants that have been decommissioned or about to be decommissioned, like Diablo Canyon or the three stacks in Morro Bay. Can you give me a sense of how important this could be?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would ask Ken to repeat maybe the numbers that he mentioned towards the beginning of his introduction.
Actually, Bob, right now the Energy Commission under AB 525 was directed to study the maximum feasible capacity for offshore wind off of California. And it's in the process of doing that. They had a meeting this past week. Originally, they came out, so I can find the numbers. They came out with, I think, 1 gigawatt by 2030 and 10 by 2045. And there's been a lot of public support for increasing those numbers to as much as 50 gigawatts by 2045 and in excess of 5 gigawatts by 2030, although nobody seems to really think you can build that much offshore wind that short a time frame. I mean, there's standing up the industry, the West Coast industry, to supply this stuff. I mean, these turbines are too big to use any port in San Francisco Bay because the turbines wouldn't fit under the Golden Gate Bridge. You've got to figure out some way on the West Coast where you're going to manufacture some of these things so you can then transport them by barge. So that's a little bit about the scale as I understand what they're talking about.
A couple of things to add to that. I did take a look at the CEC. So in May of this year, the California Energy Commission recommended some initial targets in its staff report. It's in the process of revising those, but the targets that it had recommended were 3 gigawatts by 2030, and it was looking at either Morro Bay alone or a combination of Morro Bay and Humboldt to generate that amount. And then by 2045, it was projecting 10 to 15 gigawatts could come from facilities off the California coast. They may revise those numbers upwards. There's been some new data from UC Berkeley and NREL, which look at technical and economic feasibility largely rather than environmental factors that have projected larger numbers. So we could see some revision on that front. And I think Bob was getting at this. There is likely more transmission capacity in the Morro Bay area because of existing infrastructure there. So there is interest from various stakeholders and from regulatory agencies in development in that area as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Dan, you looks like you got one more question, and we take possibly one more after that, and then we're done with this segment, I think.
Thank you, Ken. I was wondering if you could comment on the generation profile of offshore wind. In particular, how it does in the 4 to 9 period in the summer, which is so critical in California. And then in general, is it blowing constantly out there so that it's kind of base load, or is it, where does it peak and how complementary is it with solar, et cetera? Thank you.
Sure, it's very complementary with solar. It's not considered a base load. It is, intermittent. It will sometimes, be zero and then sometimes be full board. But it does happen to be very complementary with solar, and that it blows in the late evening. So that's one exciting thing about offshore wind in general, and pretty much year round, but yeah.
So is it fair to say it does peak around 5 to 7, 8 p.m. of those kind of afternoon winds that we feel in the Bay, or is it a little different out there at the sea?
Yes, no, that's fair to say. That's what they've been finding.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lori and Irene. This was really informative about something that we know a little bit about, but now hopefully we know at least a little bit more, and we'll be watching as this leasing process unveils and figuring out when we can comment on as things go along. So thank you very much. Certainly appreciate you agreeing to speak today.
Yeah, thank you. It was fun chatting with you all.
Great. Okay, Bob.
Great. So the next item on the agenda is a discussion of the emerging Marin County Building Electrification Ordinance. And on June 21st, Marin Conservation League sent a letter to the Marin County Board of Supervisors indicating our support and providing for some things and providing recommendations for others. And Ken, you took the lead on writing that. How would you like to summarize what's in the letter and what comes next?
All right. So thanks, Bob. So as I think everyone or most people know, that the county is currently in a process of developing an ordinance to take effect January of 2023, consistent with its climate action plan to enact some sort of well, they call it a green building ordinance. And it's the county, as it is outlining the process at this point, is looking towards Brian Reyes, who's the sustainability director responsible for this, is outlining a process where it would be all electric. All new construction would have to be all electric, and then there would be a component that would address major remodels in the county and would require certain improvements, probably selected from a menu of choices that would encourage switching to heat pumps, water or space heat pumps. And to some extent, that's where the county ordinance is sort of headed. And I can outline the process that's going on in a minute. But then what our letter did was it supported those two concepts, that an ordinance at both the county and all of the local jurisdiction levels that would require all electric new construction going forward. And that would include incentives for major remodel projects, strong incentives to for them to install heat pumps of one sort or another in place of their gas, space, and water heating measures. We then included a section in the letter which also encouraged that the county, consistent with and this idea was consistent with a report that came out of the Marin grand jury about a month ago, to develop a process to look at how we can start addressing our existing housing stock, and in particular, and incentivizing people, or with either sticks or carrots, to start moving towards replacing their gas appliances with electric appliances, in particular the space and water heaters, and how to do that. And so we propose that the county develop a process to look at these things and come out with a report by July of 2023 as to various things that could be done by jurisdictions to encourage this, whether it additional financial incentives for people to do this, an educational effort to get out to homeowners the fact that heat pumps are viable and, with some of the rebates, cost-effective ways of replacing your existing gas appliances, and educating the contractor community on that, and potentially building in some things such as requirements that on the sale of homes, inspection reports will be required that would identify for potential buyers the age of existing gas appliances, and thus when they might need to be replaced, and what electrical upgrades might be necessary to get the house electric ready, and even possibly requiring the replacement of those gas appliances with some trigger related to when a property's sold. So that was sort of the letter we put together, and we sent it out to the Board of Supervisors. And I think there is a plan, since the county's idea is to try and come up with as close to a uniform ordinance at the county level and for each of Marin's towns and cities to pass, so that the construction community would have one standard, one requirement that they could look to, and that would also incentivize, be easier for education, et cetera, of both contractors and the homeowners. We want to get this sort of uniform approach. So I think we're going to see what we can do to try and modify that letter and send it out to a number of the cities and towns as they start gearing up through this late summer and fall to start looking at and passing an ordinance. Now, you want me to talk about the process the county's going through right now in terms of workshops, et cetera?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know if you remember, there was a meeting that took place, I think, on June 22nd, the community forum that was hosted by Brian Race and others at the county to talk about a green building ordinance and sort of what the county was thinking about. That has been followed up with so far with the first of 2 stakeholder workshops. The county invited stakeholders from the building community, developers, environmental organizations. I attended on behalf of MCL. David Muller, who's on the call here, attended on behalf of the BE squad of the Climate Reality Project. And there were also some stakeholders from the disadvantaged community, Canal Alliance and the like. And so we talked about, at the first workshop, there was some discussion of model ordinances that have been enacted by other jurisdictions and what the stakeholders thought were good about those and maybe bad about those, and what other things might be put in proposed ordinances that the stakeholders thought would be valuable. There was discussion of some of the problems that might be a beginning of a discussion of some of the problems that such an ordinance might pose to the various communities or whatever. So that was the first stakeholder meeting. There's another stakeholder meeting of the same group that's taking place next week. And it's anticipated that after that, probably in August or early September, there will be a draft ordinance coming out. We haven't actually, there is not at this point any kind of a draft ordinance that the county has circulated for anybody to look at. And but the goal is to bring it in front of the Board of Supervisors sometime in October, November, and be pushing it in all the local jurisdictions shortly after that. And coincidentally, the Marin Grand Jury report, which supports a similar approach in terms of a green ordinance, each town and jurisdiction is required to respond to that grand jury report by, I believe, September 6th. So there's a lot of momentum on this right now. Anybody who is interested in, I know the BE squad put together teams or has put of people in each of the jurisdictions, both who live in the county, unincorporated areas, and also in each of the towns, to be teed up to talk to their local electeds in public open time, but when these things come on the agenda, at agendized items to support these things. So that's what's going on as far as building electrification, green building ordinances in Marin, as far as I know.
Okay. Discussion of that. Leslie?
Yeah, good morning. Thank you, Ken and David and everyone else working on this. It's so essential. I put a question in the chat. I'll just say it out loud for you to answer, I hope. What are the goals for this? What percentage reduction is proposed or being discussed, and on what timeline? Are they looking at the state levels? Are they being a little bit more ambitious? And is there a conflict in terms of what's required to achieve REACH codes? Thanks.
My comment is, so the county effort at this point is not directed at goals in the sense of greenhouse gas reduction targets, or I haven't seen anything that talks about anticipated turnover of appliances per se. What they're focused on is, I think, addressing, getting action in areas that the county and towns have jurisdiction over, which is primarily driven by building permits. So that's new construction. So they're definitely going to address new construction, and how aggressive the targets are on the major remodels and how that's priced, if you will, remains to be seen. There are various models for these things that have already been enacted, but so that's about all I can tell you. David, you might have a different thought.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Right now, the effort is really focused on new construction for two specific reasons. One is because there is a large amount of new development proposed for Marin County through the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And just to give you a sense, we're in the BE squad, we're tracking or trying to track proposals for new development. Right now, there are either pending applications or recently approved applications for about 3,000 new units, residential units in Marin County, 3,000. And so that's just a tip of the iceberg of the 14,000 plus anticipated by RENA. So if you think about it, if those new residential developments are dual fuel, every jurisdiction has a goal to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. If those are dual fuel, they're going to be increasing greenhouse gas emissions. So the real target is on new development to stop the bleeding. Don't make the patient worse as the first goal. The other reason to focus on new is it's easier to implement. There isn't so much pushback because you're not asking owners of existing buildings to do something different than they might otherwise have done. So the emergency action, the easy action, the one that needs the most action right now is new buildings. The existing structures it's a difficult challenge. It's going to take decades to play out, and it will play out. The other thing is there's this time gap before there will be either regional or state level requirements to require that new buildings be all electric. So again, the only play is for local jurisdictions to take action. So that's why the focus is on that right now. And Leslie, it's really about it's about avoiding making the problem worse rather than achieving specific reductions. When we get it more into the existing buildings, which the grand jury report clearly is recommending that the county take on the existing buildings, and other entities are working on that as well. We'll get there. But this was sort of the burning platform, is get the new buildings taken care of right now.
Yeah, I don't have any quibble with that in the least. Of course, let's tackle what's coming, and that is the building ordinances is the way to do that. It'd be great if it were consistent across all 12 jurisdictions, but on burnout, replacement on burnout is essential. And there are lots of other communities and jurisdictions around the Bay and in other places that are using essentially their police power over public health to make some of these requirements. So I appreciate that you guys are following this more closely locally than I am. I would encourage everyone to pay attention to what San Mateo County is doing, what Berkeley is doing, obviously, and Oakland, and just regionally, as well as Petaluma. We're all in the same boat here and on the same page in terms of recognizing that this is an emergency and we don't have time to play this out cautiously, carefully, et cetera. But there's obvious constraints, right? And what we want to do is avoid lawsuits, et cetera. So, and obviously the EIR process, if we get into more protracted reach codes, is a big issue as well in terms of cost. So yeah, I just want to encourage everyone here to continue to put pressure on moving with all due haste, as if 2030 was the end point and not 2035 or 2040 or 45. So anyway, thank you all for what you do. I'm so grateful.
Hey, Leslie, if I can just add one thing really quickly, just to give you an order of magnitude. In Marin County, there's about 120,000 residences. The average life of a water heater or furnace is about 20 years. So that means there's about 10,000 replacements a year just in Marin County. So the point is, you're absolutely right. We need to address those replacements and get those starting to be replaced with heat pump models instead of gas models. So it is the bigger impact, as well as not making the problem worse with the new development.
Bill?
Yeah, thanks. Just to add to the discussion of the timeline that Leslie brings up, excuse me. I also want to acknowledge the leadership from Ken and David in really moving this forward. The grand jury report, I think, lays out quite a potentially very positive timeline. Ken mentioned that by actually it's January 1st of this coming year of 2023 is the timeline that it sets for adoption of the two elements that we've been talking about, the new construction and major rehab. But it also has a third recommendation that gets right to the existing building question, and that's to have a comprehensive countywide electrification of buildings plan in place a year later, January 1st of 2024. So that's an ambitious timeline, and that I think is what we really that's an element of this that we need to focus on to carry forward and to establish, and while we have their attention, establish in the minds of the county and all the jurisdictions that we do need to address existing gas appliances and replacing those in existing buildings. And the grand jury report is very good on this. I think it spends, well, first of all, I'd recommend it to everybody. It's a great, very well written, just amazing, amazingly well written and thorough document. It's 19 pages long, so it's a fairly easy read. 5 of those pages go to existing buildings, and it goes into 4 or 5 different alternatives for that. The MCL letter acknowledges that and focuses on one that wasn't brought up there, which is time of sale as being a critical point, at least for evaluating the needs of buildings. But I just think the other dimension of that report is that every jurisdiction has to respond to it, as was mentioned, by early September. So there's an opportunity there to get before each jurisdiction, in written form, but also at the microphone, to really encourage them to adopt what is before them from the county, but also to join that effort of planning in the upcoming year with the goal of really getting feasible plans and actions in place. And I just got to say, always this comes back around to funding. And that's a critical thing. We've got to say, hey, that this is a 34% of our greenhouse gas emissions. This is a time to put some funding and to find the funding from the state and feds to close any gap that may exist between the cost of going electric in buildings.
Okay, David, and
yeah. One other thing I'd like to add, just so everyone's really clear on this, I was talking about the urgency of addressing new development because of the real push around from the RENA requirements, but I want to make sure everyone's clear that there won't be a broad regulatory requirement about addressing existing buildings until they're anticipating the 27-29 timeframe. And that would be from the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, which is anticipating requiring nitrogen oxide emissions requirements for residential scale space and water heaters in those timeframes, 27 and 29. So just to kind of put a time frame on this, if the county can implement a plan by January 1st, 24, you'd have 24, 25, 26, probably all of 27. You would have 4 years in there before there's some regional requirement that would drive all purchases of new replacement equipment to heat pumps. So there really is urgency around this. And think about those numbers I mentioned a minute ago, about 10,000 replacements of gas, space, and water heaters per year just in Marin County. So right there, if you took that times 4 years, that's 40,000 units. It's a lot. So I just want to emphasize the urgency of addressing not only the new because of RENA, but also the existing. Thanks for this opportunity to talk about this. The more people that are really clear on how these pieces fit together, the more impact we're all going to have.
All right. Kate?
Yeah, I just still have some questions on if there are any calculations on, for example, David, the 3,000 new homes that are in the planning pipeline in the county, how much additional electricity needs to be generated to meet that supply, and whether MCE is integrated into this planning, or if there is any planning around that. I'm also wondering how you can work with big developments like the Northgate Town Center that has paid lip service to electric, going all electric, but I'm not sure that the developers really understand the details of what that might look like when they start to get past conceptual planning to, really getting down to the nitty gritty of design for their different buildings, both the retail part and the multi-family part. And so I'm just thinking about the next steps and what might those be, and how we can think about what incentives there are for people that are going to be that they might want to support also the REACH codes within the jurisdictions. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but that's what I've been thinking about.
Shall I try a quick response?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are just great questions. There was a lot of stuff in there. The thing that I can offer up is, yes, MCE is all over this, PG&E is all over this, and the California Independent System Operator is all over this. I was recently on a conference with including representatives of PG&E and the Independent System Operator, and I just asked them point blank, are you guys worried about all this electrification coming? Are you going to be able to handle this, both in terms of generation resources, transmission, distribution? And they said, it's going to be challenging, but we can do this, because it doesn't all happen at once. And even when you think about Marin County, think about those 3,000 units I just made reference to a minute ago about proposed new development. That's just the first 3,000 of what could be as much as 14,000 or even more. So it doesn't happen all at once. It's going to play out over time. So it's not like we're headed for a cliff that we're going to go off. It's just that generation planning, transmission planning, distribution planning is going to have to stay a step ahead. And when I ask them these questions point blank of the people that are doing that planning, they're saying, yes, we're on it. It's going to be challenging, but we can do it. The one other thing I would throw in there into the mix that I'm not sure everybody's dialed into yet is the emerging concept of smart panels. Virtually all electrical load serving buildings now is managed through dumb panels that are simply designed to basically cover the maximum electrical load the building might have. But just now, I mean, really within the last 6 months to a year, people are starting to come out with smart panels, even down to the residential level, that can manage load. So you can literally shave off peak load. So instead of having to have electrical supply to meet the absolute peak load if everything was on at once, one of the tools that can be used to manage the load is smart panels, which would shed less important loads during periods of high demand. So I think it's going to be one of these things where there's lots of tools brought into the mix. It's going to be challenging, but from what I understand, it's going to be doable.
Mm-hmm.
That helps.
Just one thing to add on that is they're now coming out with heat pump water heaters that run on 110. Yep. And so you don't need to upgrade your service you can plug it in anywhere. So, and same with, there's some space that are heat pump space heaters that are also run on 110. So things are improving.
Okay, so why don't we move to the next agenda item, which is Marin Conservation League's comment letter on the California Air Resources Board climate change emissions reduction scoping plan through 2045. And Belle, why don't you summarize what was in the letter and our concerns?
Yeah. Well, I guess that you'd say that MCL welcomed the opportunity to comment on the CARB draft 2022 climate change scoping plan. The plan is vitally important because it sets state climate policy for the next 5 years. And so MCL acknowledged support of CARB's purpose and intent to plan for carbon neutrality by 2045. This is their first goal of that sort. At the same time, we expressed concerns on a range of issues, including the urgency of adopting a goal of carbon neutrality by at least 2035, distinct from 2045, accelerating California's transition to a clean energy grid, and analyzing the feasibility and problems associated with carbon capture technologies. So MCL will be involved in the CARB review process now that it has sent in a letter and it's part of it. We have heard nothing yet from CARB about its response to the hundreds, maybe thousands of responses from the environmental and science community, but we will. And we are also planning to have a panel of scientists possibly in the fall to discuss these issues at a CARB meeting. So that's the kind of summary and where we stand. A copy of the letter is available. And any questions? Okay.
I would say this, that one of the issues, one of the concerns that Marin Conservation League expressed was the extent of reliance on carbon capture and storage and direct air capture for meeting the net neutral goals by 2045. That a number of these technologies are very high cost currently, and some of them have yet to be proven, let alone shown to be economically feasible. So the flip side of, so that's a real concern, because there really is an attempt on the part of the fossil fuel industry to emphasize carbon capture and storage and direct air capture in order to avoid reducing emissions now. That said, I think that the scoping plan piqued our interest about, well, what is ahead for carbon capture and storage and direct air capture? So that's an issue that we're going to be looking at. I think what's could be considered to be a positive element around that in the scoping plan is that if it finances innovation in that area, then that's all to the good. I don't think we need as many ponies in the race as possible. The problem is simply to avoid having it be a way for emitters to get away with emitting, and then we miss our targets down the road.
One of the things, Bob, that we are waiting to hear from CARB is they got a lot of responses statewide about these issues, and we don't know. The review is going on what kinds of changes they're going to make in the document itself between now and December, when it's supposed the final one is due. So that's something we're going to be watching, as others are, and we'll get back to you on that.
Okay. So is there further discussion, Kate?
So I think that CARB has some listening sessions on the scoping plan still underway. There's one in the Bay Area, Laney College in Oakland on the 28th of July. It's an in-person. And then there's a virtual one in August, like August 8th or August 9th. So I just don't know if MCL is going to orally participate in any of those. But I also just personally would expect that they probably won't respond until all of their listening sessions are over. But I don't know the process in particular.
Well, we expect to hear back from couple of staff people about that and get a better sense of their process.
Okay, so is there further discussion on this? If there isn't, then let's move to reports from organizations. Bill, do you want to talk about Sustainable Centerville?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, we have several things going on at City Council right now of various magnitude. In the meeting actually coming up on Monday, maybe the most important one for us has actually been deferred because it's still apparently in the lawyer's hands, but that's a new street tree ordinance for San Rafael. And about half a dozen of us have been working on redlining that and marking it up, and it's been pretty well received by staff. So we are looking forward to that, hopefully by September, being enacted and being the, more importantly, even being the first step towards implementing the quite comprehensive tree policies that are embedded in the new General Plan 2040. So that's an important thing that we're, supporting and moving forward with. On Monday night will be consideration of the leaf blower ban to go in San Rafael to go into effect in October. We are advocating on the model of Fairfax. Is Jody still here? Nope. That this be expanded to include all off-road engines, which together represent 1% of our carbon footprint pie chart, which is small but significant and something we can do something about. The leaf blowers are just a slice of that. So we want to try to expand on that one. And then finally, the SB9, the state law that mandates that jurisdictions be able basically to accommodate up to 4 units on what's now zoned single family districts. San Rafael's response to that is on the agenda for Monday night. The thing that we're tracking on that, I mean, we're for it because it's a way of getting more, and smaller units incorporated into already built out areas. So that's a good thing. We'll be supporting that. However, there is a provision in there that would eliminate the natural state requirements on hillside districts, which is mostly where single family stuff is. So that's of concern, and we're going to flag that for the second time to at least make folks aware that there's something there that needs to be protected, and nature shouldn't be discarded first. Anybody interested in that, let me know, and I can key you in on what that's about. Thanks.
David, do you have anything to add to what you've already said around the EV and BE squad?
Yeah, just a couple of things. Back on the BE squad, one of the things that we've got going, or 2 things I want to mention. One is we're monitoring as best we can new development in Marin County and doing direct outreach to the developers, asking them basically 2 questions. What are their plans about, and are they willing to commit to all electric for all the infrastructure, and to go ahead and put in EV chargers as well, go beyond the state requirements. And we've had pretty good success on that, but it's something that we've got going both on the EV side and the building electrification side. The other thing I think many of you know, on the building electrification side, we're doing this direct outreach using the jurisdictional teams that Ken mentioned. And we're just in the process right now of issuing our second round of talking points to tie in the jurisdictions need to respond to that grand jury report. And what a great way to do it, by committing to adopt the updated green building code that the jurisdictions are working on now. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was on the electric vehicle squad side. Two things. One is, some of you may know this, but we're really getting some traction around this issue of reliability of public EV charging, which is proving to be not very reliable. And we're really getting some traction both at the state and the federal levels on that. So that's something that we're working with Ride and Drive Clean Bay Area on that. And then the other thing, which is just a very new emerging thing, we've kind of heard through the side that the county, there's some appetite at the county to perhaps pursue a model EV charger reach code for EV charging reach or EV charger requirements, sort of along the lines of a reach code for building electrification requirements. That the county may have some appetite around that. We put together a small team to start investigating that. So there may be an opportunity on that one. And then one last thing, some of you are probably aware that the MCEP has been working on putting together a EV plan, a countywide EV acceleration plan, funded in part by TAM. Well, two of our members of our EV squad were asked to review administrative drafts of that in the last couple of weeks. So an administrative draft is out. I was one of the reviewers. It's a really good report and has a lot of strong information. It's called the Marin County EV Acceleration Strategy is what it's called. Marin County EV Acceleration Strategy. And I'm expecting that drafts are going to be issued for broad public review probably in the next couple of weeks is my guess. That's it.
Thank you. Belle? Oh, Kate, you have a question?
Just a quick question, David, is the EV acceleration strategy, does that have to do with the charging infrastructure or getting people into EV?
It's broad, it's everything.
Okay.
It's charging infrastructure, it's information, it's everything. So,
Okay.
and I say it's a really strong report. If you're familiar with climate action plans, it's very much in the style of a climate action plan, but it's a very singular focus on accelerating EV adoption.
Thank you. Bye.
Susan?
Thank you. I just wanted to bring up the fact that there was a court hearing on the Costco gas station issue on Wednesday, and the judge had issued a preliminary report that he and I'm not an attorney, and getting all the legalities absolutely correct is going to be challenging for me. But the judge had agreed that the city was somewhat negligent in doing a mitigated negative deck and not being thorough enough on the impacts of the air quality issues related to the 28 pump gas station. And of course, the Costco attorneys and the city attorney rejected his suggestion and came up with some other issues. So what ended up happening is that the judge has requested that the two parties, the defendant, meet with the attorney for the lawsuit and kind of iron out the disagreements with each other and report back to him by, I think it's the middle of August. So the ruling hasn't been finalized, but initially it was somewhat favorable to the the group that brought the lawsuit. And it's after, it's been on about a year now that it has finally come to this point, which isn't settled yet, but it was looking encouraging on Wednesday.
Great. Belle? You're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Just quick report on Ecologically Sound Practices Partnership. We had a celebratory meeting this week. The Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority has accepted the Ecologically Sound Practices Partnership Best Practices document. And it took a year for that review to take place. And it's a moment of satisfaction and much work ahead of us. But I just wanted to tell everybody how pleased we all are that these guidelines, these best practices will be at the core of the work of MWPA and its wildfire plans. And we have what we're next steps of what we'll be doing, and we'll be posting and distributing these. And we have also we have a website. ESP has its own website. In addition to being posted on the MWPA website, we have our own, and I can make that available to people because it includes a lot of the work that we have been doing, and it does include the guidelines. So I'll mention that. And then the other one I'll comment on is the Marin Biomass project, which is, we have issued an RFP for the project consultant, and it's out, and we will be getting responses in August. And so that project will be off the ground in September, and the study itself. And so we're really pleased by that. So it's my report.
Great. So are there any other reports? If there are not, then the next meeting next month in August will be, we're hoping to have Christina O'Rourke talk about that MCEP plan, and possibly another speaker. We'll see what's possible and what's not. So with that, I think we're done, folks. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.